Jesus said, "I am among you as one who serves." And indeed, that is the way he lived his life. That didn't mean that he didn't have opinions about how things were being done around him or about how people were being treated. But he never sought kingship in the sense that we mean that word today, nor did he seek recognition for his good deeds. In fact, quite the opposite. And today we're asked to consider what it means to serve in the way that Jesus asked his disciples to do when he called them to follow him. They seem to have had a hard time doing that, so it's not really surprising that we find the task hard too. When I think of the word servant or of going into service, I think of Downton Abbey and its hierarchy of servants without whom none of the main protagonists could have enjoyed the very classy lifestyle that they did. Like most of you, I'm sure I can recall Mrs. Hughes, the kindly but efficient housekeeper, and Carson, the all-essential haughty butler, Mrs. Patmore, the incredibly resourceful cook, and her hapless kitchen maid, Daisy. And I remember all of those other positions that operated below stairs, so that the Downton family could preside upstairs. It seems that even among the downstairs crowd, though, there was an extreme hierarchy imposed. You'll remember that they all had to stand when Carson arrived for his meals, and no one really paid any attention to the lowest on the scale. Even amongst the lowest, there was always that ambition to be raised higher up the chain of command. In fact, we're told that Carson himself began at Downton as a lowly footman. And yet Jesus tells his disciples and us that if we are to follow him, it is our destiny to be servants. I think that the low stairs kind of servants, and that their ambitions are not welcome or justified. And he modeled that role for them by performing the lowliest of tasks. He washed their smelly feet. Our gospel story today, in which the disciples are found arguing about which of them is the greatest, is reminiscent of other such occasions during Jesus' ministry, when the disciples, or in one case the mother of two of them, are seeking for a special place in God's kingdom. The way that Luke tells the story today makes this kind of competitive squabbling particularly poignant, since he tells that this conversation takes place immediately after the Last Supper, when Jesus has tried very hard to make it clear to them what is to become of him. Yet even at this critical and personally gut-wrenching time, with the shadow of the cross hanging over them all, some of them are still focused on themselves and their future glory. John tells us in his gospel that Jesus emphasized this theme of servanthood in a very concrete manner at the Last Supper by taking that bowl of water and washing each of his disciples' feet. It didn't seem to make any difference, because even as they left that place, they were still arguing. Mark's gospel tells us a similar story. Jesus has, for the first time, prophesied that he will meet with a violent death. And again, the disciples are arguing about their own future glory. At that time, Jesus' message is even clearer than in the story I just read. Let me remind you of that account in Mark chapter 9. Then they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, Jesus asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way here?" But they were silent, for on the way they'd argued with one another about who was the greatest. He sat down with them and said, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." And then he took a little child and put him among them. Taking him in his arms, he said to the disciples, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." Recently, I've been thinking about what it means to be a servant. We've heard a great deal about essential services recently during this COVID pandemic times. And we've gone out of our way to say thank you to so many of those who serve us, especially those in the healthcare field. But there are so many others, sometimes I think they get forgotten, without whose duties being done every single day, we would be in really serious trouble. I'm thinking in particular of those who work at our garbage dumps or who collect our refuse and our recycling every week. I'm thinking about those controversial migrant workers who grow and harvest our Ontario veggies and fruit and help to keep the price of those precious commodities down, while often being housed in converted garages or old trailers that none of us would ever dream of inhabiting. I'm thinking about all of our volunteers who've kept the breakfast program and the community dinners going through all of this. And of Johan, our wonderful caretaker who frequently gets to do all the cleaning up after all of these events. And I'm recalling all of those seamen who ply the waterways of our world, including our own canal here, who bring us so many of the things we take for granted today. Many of those men have become prisoners on their ships during this COVID time. Even the mission to seafarers in our ports can't make visits to the ships or offer the normal services to them because of the restrictions around the pandemic. I'm certain that each of us could add to that number. But today, as we find ourselves thinking about what it means to be a servant, we need to focus just for a few minutes about just how risky and challenging being a servant really is for so many in our troubled world. And it has always been risky and often dangerous to be a servant, as Jesus' disciples were about to discover after his death. Tomorrow is the Feast of St. Bartholomew, and the gospel reading you just heard me read is that assigned to his feast day. Bartholomew is certainly one of the lesser-known apostles. Yes, he was one of the chosen 12, but I don't imagine that any of you could tell me a significant thing that he did or said that is recorded in our four Gospels. And that's because there aren't any. Bartholomew is known more by name and post-resurrection reputation or legend than for anything that he did or said when he walked close to Jesus. However, it is very clear from the history and tradition of the early church that he must have made a significant contribution to the expansion of the church in its early years, whether in Egypt or Armenia, or perhaps even further east in modern India. It's also very clear from the tradition that he met his death in a very gruesome manner as he was martyred. Was he one of the disciples arguing about who is the greatest in our story today? Or was he one of the silent ones when Jesus asked what they'd been arguing about? Or was he perhaps walking too far away from Jesus to even hear the question? The silence that followed Jesus' question, as it did each time he had to ask it, must surely have indicated the guilt and regret of those involved in the squabbling. In fact, it reminds me of being a teacher and a couple of the kids at the back of the class are talking very earnestly between each other while I'm up front trying to get their attention. And finally I stop and say, Johnny and Andrew, would you mind sharing with us what's so important at this time? And of course, there's giggling and dead silence from those two little boys. Perhaps the disciples needed to discuss such things as their own future greatness from the very fact that they couldn't make any sense of Jesus' dire predictions about himself. And so they tried to hang on to a shred of hope for their own future. I think that those who chose the readings for Bartholomew's feast day chose that gospel passage to emphasize that Bartholomew heard and took to heart the teaching that Jesus shared with them at this crucial time in his ministry. The greatest among you must become like the youngest, and the leader like one who serves. Recently, I've been spending time with some of our congregation who aspire to be deacons among us. That is, to hold the title and special status of Reverend Deacon. I've written a short bio of each of them all, and you'll have the opportunity to meet them through those writings. But I do want to emphasize that in spite of the fact that we as a church honor and encourage certain ordained ministries among us, whether it be deacon, priest, or bishop, each and every one of us is really a deacon, because that word simply means servant. And every member of this church, regardless of whether they wear a collar or not, belongs to a servant community. This place would not be here 225 plus years after its founding unless there had been a myriad of folks volunteering and serving here over those decades. And all of us who are ordained start our ordained ministry as deacons as a reminder that even though we may go on to become priest or bishop, we're always working as servants of God, as Jesus did before us. Now, I have to confess that not all of our forebears in the churches, and I'm talking now about particularly the ordained ones, have acted in that humble and self-giving manner of the history of the church. But regardless, that's what we're all called to do and to be. It's been quite the week south of the border, hasn't it? None of us could have missed the drama going on down there with the Democratic National Convention and the current president trying to undermine everything they said. There's a lot more coming this week too, only in reverse. But I was moved by some of the speeches offered virtually at that convention, and I thought that one particular quote might remind us of the importance and relevance of what Jesus had to say in our gospel today. Senator Kamala Harris, in her acceptance speech for the Democratic nomination as vice president, spoke powerfully and gratefully of the women who had gone before her. She especially called out her own mother in the following words. There's another woman whose name isn't known, whose story isn't shared, another woman whose shoulders I stand on, and that's my mother, Shimala Gopalan Harris. She came here from India at age 19 to pursue her dream of curing cancer. Kamala goes on to talk about her parents, how they met and married and had 2 little girls, and how when she was just 5 years old, her parents split and her mother took on the daunting task of raising her girls on her own. And she continues. And even as she taught us to keep family at the center of our world, she also pushed us to see a world beyond ourselves. She taught us to be conscious and compassionate about the struggles of all people, to believe public service is a noble cause and the fight for justice is a shared responsibility. My mother taught me that service to others gives life purpose and meaning. And oh, how I wish she were here tonight. I keep thinking about that 25-year-old Indian woman, all of 5 feet tall, who gave birth to me and taught me so many things. Service to others gives life, purpose, and meaning, was the lesson that this tiny immigrant taught her daughters. And that sounds very much like Jesus' words to his disciples. But I am among you as one who serves. And in both the case of Kamala's mother, of St. Bartholomew, their greatness wasn't really truly appreciated or revealed or even recognized until after their deaths. And I think the same thing could be said of Jesus too. Amen.